In 1974, two men vanished into an infamous watery labyrinth, chasing a discovery that would cost one of them everything. This is the story of Agen Allwedd. The Agen Allwedd cave system in South Wales is a monster of stone and shadow. Its tunnels twist like serpentine veins beneath the rolling green hills, swallowing light and sound into a void older than human history. By 1974, less than 30% of its passages had been mapped. The rest remained a mystery, guarded by submerged tunnels called sumps. These are water-filled choke points where rock ceilings dip below the waterline, forcing divers into claustrophobic aquatic trenches. Martyn, Farr, and Roger Solari were not your ordinary explorers. At 23 and 26 years old, they had already earned reputations as relentless pioneers in the United Kingdom's caving community. Both men had cut their teeth on dry caving expeditions, navigating jagged crevices and unstable boulder fields for nearly a decade. But cave diving? That was a new obsession. By 1974, they had logged just 3 years of dive experience, a fraction of the expertise needed for what they were about to attempt. Their target was the third sump in Agen Allwedd, a flooded tunnel recently discovered by veteran explorer John Parker. No one had yet dared to cross it. Most cave divers avoided sumps longer than 300 feet, but this one stretched 850 feet, nearly 3 football fields of submerged darkness. To Martyn and Roger, it was an irresistible challenge. The plan was simple, at least on paper. In May 1974, Martyn would conduct a solo reconnaissance dive to assess the sump. Roger, sidelined by a knee injury, would stay behind. Solo cave diving defies every modern safety protocol, but this was the 1970s, an era when exploration often trumped prudence. Divers relied on cobbled-together gear, rubber wetsuits prone to tearing, single-hose regulators that frequently free-flowed, and aluminum tanks strapped to their backs with nylon webbing. There were no dive computers, no guideline reels with glow sticks, no emergency air reserves. Just a depth gauge, a compass, and raw nerve. Martyn's journey to the third sump was a gauntlet of suffering. The cave's entrance led to a mile-long obstacle course of boulder chokes, collapsed tunnels where house-sized rocks blocked the path. To pass, Martyn shoved his gear through gaps narrower than his shoulders, then wriggled after it, his chest scraping stone. The air reeked of damp limestone and mildew. Temperatures hovered near 40 degrees, leaching heat through his layers of wool and neoprene. When he finally reached the third sump, the water's surface glinted like black oil. Martyn strapped on his twin tanks, each holding 80 cubic feet of compressed air. The rule of thirds, a sacred doctrine in cave diving, dictated he should turn back once he'd consumed 1/3 of his air, reserving the rest for the return trip and emergencies. But Martyn had already broken one rule by diving solo. What was one more? He plunged in. The water swallowed him whole. His flashlight beam carved a shaky path through the silt, revealing walls studded with jagged limestone teeth. Every kick stirred clouds of sediment, reducing visibility to inches. The cold seeped through his wetsuit, numbing his fingers. 8 minutes into the dive, his regulator began to free flow, blasting precious air into the water in a torrent of bubbles. Martyn clamped a gloved hand over the mouthpiece, stifling the leak. He had no backup. 12 minutes later, he surfaced in an air pocket, his tanks half empty. The third sump was behind him. Ahead lay a new tunnel, a snaking passage of jagged rock that stretched 1,800 feet, nearly 1/3 of a mile. Martyn crawled through it, his boots slipping on wet stone, until he reached the edge of another sump. This was the fourth. Its water stretched into blackness, an abyss that could hide anything. A new chamber, a connection to another cave system, or a dead end. Martyn's pulse raced, but his air gauge told the truth. He had burned through 2/3 of his supply. To proceed would be suicide. Reluctantly, he turned back. Surfacing hours later, Martyn carried more than just his gear. He carried a secret. The fourth sump was there, waiting. June 15th, 1974. Roger Solari and Martyn Farr stood at the mouth of Agen Allwedd, their gear clattering as they adjusted harnesses strapped with 6 aluminum air tanks. Each tank weighed 35 pounds and held 80 cubic feet of compressed air, enough for 40 minutes underwater under perfect conditions. Cave diving is never perfect. The journey to the third sump took 4 hours. They crawled through boulder chokes, sections where collapsed ceilings left gaps barely wider than their shoulders. Sharp limestone tore their cotton overalls and wool sweaters, the standard gear of 1970s cave explorers. Hypothermia was a constant threat. Temperatures inside the cave never rose above 40 degrees. At the third sump, the men swapped their half-empty tanks for fresh ones. Twin steel regulators hissed as they bit down on mouthpieces. Martyn led the dive, Roger close behind. Emerging from the water, they entered the chamber Martyn had discovered weeks earlier. Roger stared at the jagged passage ahead. This was uncharted territory. The new tunnel stretched 1,800 feet. They crawled over gravel beds littered with cave pearls, tiny limestone spheres formed by dripping water over thousands of years. These geological oddities crunched under their boots, a reminder of the cave's ancient indifference to human ambition. As they neared the fourth sump, the air grew stale. Moisture clung to their skin. Roger's jokes faded. Both men felt it, a primal unease, a tightening in the chest. Later interviews revealed Martyn's regret. "We should have turned back," he said. "The cave was warning us." They dove anyway. Roger floated near the tunnel's ceiling, his buoyancy compensator, a rudimentary inflatable vest, keeping him glued to the rock. Martyn sank toward the silt floor, weighted down by extra guideline reels. Between them, they unspooled 400 feet of nylon line, their only tether to the surface. Lose the line, and they'd be lost forever. The fourth sump was a claustrophobic nightmare. The ceiling dipped to 18 inches in places, forcing them to tilt their heads sideways. Stalactites snagged their air hoses. Every kick stirred silt, reducing visibility to 0. They navigated by touch, fingers tracing the guideline like a lifeline. 400 feet in, Roger's reel ran out. Martyn tied his line to Roger's, the knot clumsy with cold, stiffened fingers. Through the murk, he saw Roger clawing at his mask. Sinus barotrauma, a common injury caused by pressure changes, had spiked pain through Roger's skull. Divers compare it to an ice pick driven into the forehead. Roger signaled to continue. Martyn hesitated. He'd already used 1/3 of his air. The rule of thirds demanded he turn back. But ahead, the tunnel sloped upward. Martyn's curiosity overruled caution. He swam on, burning through his reserve. The silt cleared briefly, revealing a gravel slope. Martyn clawed upward, depth gauge ticking. 10 feet, 8, 5. 3 feet below the surface, his light hit solid rock. No air pocket, no escape. Martyn hovered at the gravel wall, his flashlight beam trembling. The rock ceiling above him was unbroken, a solid slab of limestone crushing his hopes of an air pocket. His depth gauge read 3 feet. 3 feet from salvation. 3 feet from suffocation. He had burned through 55% of his air. The math was merciless. To escape the fourth sump, he needed to swim 300 feet back to its entrance, then 850 feet through the third sump, all on a reserve tank holding just 40 cubic feet of air. Even if he rationed each breath, survival hinged on reaching the partial tank they'd left at the third sump. One delay, one snagged hose, and he'd drown. Martyn signaled Roger to retreat, slashing a hand across his throat in the universal out-of-air gesture. Through the silt-clouded water, he glimpsed Roger near the tunnel's ceiling. The older diver's eyes bulged behind his fogged mask. His hands clawed at his regulator, a silent scream trapped behind glass. Then the silt closed in, erasing Roger from view. Martyn turned and kicked hard, following the guideline back toward the sump's entrance. Every second counted. Cave divers in the 1970s relied on J-valves, a rudimentary safety feature that reserved 200 psi of air, about 10 breaths, if the diver forgot to monitor their gauge. Martyn's tank lacked even this. His only warning was the sudden, gut-wrenching gasp of an empty regulator. It happened 130 feet into his retreat. His primary tank died mid-breath. Martyn yanked the reserve lever, switching to his backup. The gauge read 900 psi, enough for 20 minutes if he breathed slowly, but panic kills faster than hypoxia. His pulse thundered in his ears as he swam, each exhalation roaring through the silence. Surfacing in the Sump 4 pool, Martyn ripped off his mask. "Roger!" The name echoed off the walls. No reply. The water remained still. He waited 40 minutes, shivering in the 40-degree air. Without dry suits, hypothermia sapped his strength. Every second stretched into an eternity. Finally, he gripped the guideline and pulled. It came easily, too easily. 430 feet from the entrance, the line ended in a clean cut. Roger had severed it. Here's why. In 1974, tank switches were a death trap. Divers had to remove their entire harness underwater, swap tanks, then re-secure the straps, all while fighting buoyancy and panic. If Roger's tank jammed or his hands numbed from cold, he might have dropped his gear. Tangled in the guideline, he'd have one choice: cut free or drown. The silt told the rest. Without the line, Roger would have spun in circles, disoriented by zero visibility. He'd have kicked blindly, exhausting his air in minutes. The fourth sump had no air pockets, no exits. His final breaths would have been gulps of freezing water. Martyn's escape was a nightmare of split-second decisions. The third sump demanded 850 feet of swimming with 30 cubic feet of air, less than 15 minutes of breathing time. Halfway through, his legs cramped from the cold. His regulator free-flowed, spitting precious air into the water. He slammed the mouthpiece against his thigh, silencing the leak. When he reached the third sump's exit, the partial tank they'd left had 200 psi remaining. 5 minutes of air, enough to crawl through the final mile of dry passages, where he vomited from adrenaline and grief. Surfacing at dawn, Martyn collapsed. Roger's wife, Linda, received the news by telegram. There would be no body to recover, no closure. Agen Allwedd kept its dead, and here's why. In 1974, cave diving operated under a code of self-reliance that bordered on recklessness. Explorers like Martyn and Roger typically worked solo or in pairs, with no safety nets. There were no backup teams waiting at the surface, no emergency divers on standby. Modern protocols, like the 2-in 2-out rule mandating 4 divers per mission, didn't exist. If something went wrong, survivors had to mount their own rescues while hypoxic and hypothermic. This lack of support wasn't negligence, it was the norm. The diving community viewed cave exploration as a personal gamble, where survival hinged on skill and luck. Technology offered no lifelines. Sonar mapping, underwater cameras, and GPS tracking were science fiction back in 1974. Divers navigated using nylon guidelines and memory, tools rendered useless in silt-clouded water. The fourth sump's sediment was finer than flour. A single fin kick could reduce visibility to 0 for hours, turning the water into a blinding void. Search teams later admitted that even if they tried to recover Roger, they'd have been diving blind. The cave's shifting silt would have buried his body within days, sealing him in a watery grave long before modern recovery tools arrived in the 1980s. Then there was the gear. Each aluminum tank weighed 70 pounds out of water, more than half the average diver's body weight. Hauling them through sumps required superhuman stamina as divers battled buoyancy and narrow passages. Recovery efforts would have demanded twice the equipment, extra tanks, ropes, and body bags. But the fourth sump's tightest sections measured just 18 inches across, forcing divers to remove tanks and push them ahead. Retrieving a body in these conditions wasn't just difficult, it was suicidal. The cave's architecture weaponized its own dangers, making Roger's recovery a logistical impossibility. Agen Allwedd didn't just kill him, it kept him. Martyn Farr crawled out of Agen Allwedd's entrance at dawn on June 16, 1974, his body trembling from 12 hours of hypothermia and adrenaline. His wool sweater hung in tatters, shredded by limestone teeth. His hands, raw and bleeding, clutched a mud-caked dive log. Inside it, coordinates for the fourth sump and proof of Roger's disappearance. There were no cell phones, no emergency radios. To alert authorities, Martyn drove 40 minutes to the nearest village, Bryn Mawr, and begged the postmaster to send a telegram to Roger's wife, Linda. The message was blunt: Roger missing. Recovery unlikely. By midday, a search team assembled at the cave's mouth. It included local volunteers, 2 off-duty police divers, and Martyn himself. None understood the true scale of the challenge. Cave diving in 1974 lacked standardized recovery protocols. Rescuers carried the same flawed gear Martyn and Roger had used: single-hose regulators prone to free flows, canvas harnesses that chafed under tank weight, and dive lights powered by leaky lead-acid batteries. The fourth sump's silt had settled by then, but its narrowest sections, some just 16 inches wide, made transporting recovery gear impossible. Divers would need to squeeze through with tanks strapped to their chests, risking entanglement. After 3 days, the team called off the search. "It's a suicide mission," one diver wrote in his report. Martyn refused to accept defeat. In 1981, 7 years after the accident, he returned to Agen Allwedd with better gear and a grim goal: find Roger's body. Advances in diving technology offered slim hope. New neoprene dry suits fought hypothermia. High-capacity aluminum tanks provided 90 minutes of air. But the fourth sump hadn't changed. Martyn spent 8 hours combing 670 feet of its tunnels, his guideline brushing silt-covered walls. Visibility dropped to 0 within minutes. He felt along the floor, gloves sweeping gravel beds, fingers probing crevices. Nothing. The cave hid its secrets well. The breakthrough came in October 1986, 12 years after Roger vanished. A team led by explorers Ian Rowland and Julian Walker entered Agen Allwedd, armed with tools Martyn could only have dreamed of in 1974. Ultrasonic guideline reels that pinged locations to the surface, halogen lights piercing 30 feet of murk, and wetsuits lined with argon gas for insulation. Their mission was twofold: push beyond Martyn's 1974 mapping and solve the mystery of Roger's fate. 720 feet into the fourth sump, Rowland's light grazed a pale shape on the tunnel floor. At first, he thought it was a discarded tank. Then he saw the boots. Roger Solari lay on his side, preserved in near-perfect condition. The cave's 40-degree water had slowed decomposition, leaving his features recognizable. His wetsuit, though frayed, still clung to his frame. One hand gripped a backup regulator, its mouthpiece inches from his lips. The other clutched a rusted dive knife, blade dulled from hacking at the guideline. His face, eerily calm, bore no signs of panic. The discovery forced an agonizing choice: recover the body or leave it. Rowland radioed the surface team. Extraction would require dragging Roger's remains through a mile of jagged tunnels and 3 sumps, a task requiring 20 divers and weeks of labor. Even then, collapses in the third sump made success unlikely. After a fraught debate, the team agreed Roger would stay. A brass plaque near the first sump bears Roger's name, dates, and a single line: he ventured further. Rowland returned 1 year later to finish mapping the fourth sump. He swam past Roger's body, now eerily familiar, and pushed another 155 feet to the sump's end. The discovery of Roger's body brought a sense of closure, but it also raised new questions. Had he run out of air? Had he become disoriented in the silt-filled water? The answers may never be known, but one thing is certain: the tragedy of Roger Solari serves as a stark reminder of the importance of adhering to the rules of cave diving. Martyn Farr, who went on to have a distinguished career in cave diving, later reflected on the lessons learned from that fateful day. He vowed never to break the rule of thirds again, a promise that undoubtedly saved his life on countless future dives. The rule, which dictates that 1/3 of a diver's air supply should be used for the journey out, 1/3 for the return, and 1/3 kept in reserve for emergencies, is a cornerstone of safe diving practices. In the years that followed, the Agen Allwedd cave system continued to attract explorers, each drawn by the allure of its uncharted passages. In 1987, Ian Walker, one of the divers who had discovered Roger's body the previous year, made another attempt to explore the fourth sump. This time, he pushed beyond the 720-foot mark, venturing into uncharted territory. After swimming 875 feet through the narrow water-filled passage, he finally reached the end of the sump. What he found was the elusive air pocket that Roger and Martyn had been searching for all those years ago. The chamber, aptly named the Against All Odds chamber, was a small enclosed space with no further passages or connections. It was the terminus of the sump, the final stop in a journey that had claimed Roger's life. The discovery brought a sense of closure to the story, but it also underscored the futility of the risks taken in 1974. The chamber offered no new discoveries, no hidden treasures, only the cold, hard truth that sometimes the journey is its own reward. Today, the entrance to the Agen Allwedd cave system is locked, accessible only to experienced cavers with approved permission. A plaque near the entrance honors the memory of Roger Solari, a reminder of the sacrifices made in the pursuit of exploration. The cave, with its dark, winding passages and submerged tunnels, remains a place of mystery and danger, a testament to the courage and determination of those who dare to explore its depths. Martyn Farr, who survived the ordeal, went on to become one of the most respected cave divers in the world. His experiences in the Agen Allwedd system shaped his approach to diving, instilling in him a deep respect for the rules and protocols that keep divers safe. He has often spoken about the importance of preparation, caution, and the rule of thirds, lessons learned at a great cost. The story of Roger Solari and Martyn Farr is a powerful reminder of the risks and rewards of exploration. It is a tale of ambition, curiosity, and the unyielding desire to push beyond the known limits. But it is also a cautionary tale, a reminder that nature's wonders are not to be taken lightly. The Agen Allwedd cave system, with its beauty and danger, stands as a monument to those who have ventured into its depths, and to those who have paid the ultimate price.